Hi, everybody. My name is Taylor Spaziani, and I am here with the Sexual Health Alliance. I'm here with our intern, Lori, and Midori for the 5 Minutes of Fame. So, welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, just to start off, Midori, we'd love it if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your career.
Oh my goodness, that's going to be okay. I'm going to keep it short because there is actually a TEDx talk out there that if you look up TEDx and Midori, you'll find it. Briefly, it all starts and continues to be because I'm relatively clueless. I did not plan to go into this at all. Now, a little background, born and raised in Japan, and as an early teenager, I immigrated to the United States. And I'll be blunt that part of the reason is that I did not see myself as having much of a future in Japan. I am of mixed heritage, and that does not go over too well over there at all. And something to point out to the clinicians is that different cultural backgrounds, not only do you have the cultural perception within, say, North America, but there's also the various baggages and cultural attitudes from countries and heritage of origin. So that comes in, all right? So I left as a early teenager and came to the US. Now, while being raised in Japan, I am, well, let's see, in my household environment was an all-female feminist intellectual household, unusual in Japan. However, going to public school and also absorbing the cultural ways. So one positive, very positive aspect, other than my vast culinary interest in interesting Japanese and Asian food, is that I have a very different basis in my early exposure to sexuality. Yes, there's a lot of different baggage around sexuality in Japan. However, it has not been toxified by Judeo Christian and American puritanical guilt around sexuality. It is, however, encumbered by Japanese shame around sexuality. Shame and guilt, very different, right? So, uh, I did not have the sex is bad, but I did have the sex or sexuality is not something to be talked about until you have access to the space or the context to do so. Right. So there's that. I was not encumbered by the guilt as well as the idea of what sexuality was appropriate for age and gender that is common for American kids. I had different ones, right? I also found that Japanese kids' cartoons have a lot more sexual material in it
Absolutely.
than Western ones, and also a lot more easy around the body in Japan. I went to the public baths regularly, so seeing naked women from all ages and boys up until a certain age. So I don't think I had that much issue around body image stuff, right? Because I'm seeing sagging boobs and big pregnant bellies and yeah, all of that, right? So public baths in Japan, really, I'm so glad I got to do that. Now, the feminist and the mixed heritage thing, though, my American feminist grandmother, she was a suffragette, and she gave me the perspective that I think she understood that I would have a life of potential racism against me, which is true, both in Japan and the US. But she gave me the perspective that I can come from a culture, but I do not need to be owned by a culture, that I can see from a global perspective. Now, she didn't use those words, but she set me up to be a global citizen before there was even a third culture kid as a terminology.
Mm.
So I'm grateful for that. So I went to the US as an early teenager, and then I found myself observing American teenagers like an alien anthropologist. Like, what are these strange things that these people are doing? I did not understand necking and bases and the thing in a back seat of a car and what the purpose of a prom was. I was like, and because I was already considered an outsider, that I would be staring weirdly and not getting it. People just assumed I wouldn't get it because I was a weirdo foreign kid,
Mm.
which was an advantage because I could really be the weirdo foreign kid. I was like, what are the mating rituals of the American teenager? And because I was a weirdo foreign kid, I think I was a little bit outside of the peer pressure.
Mm.
Also coming from Tokyo into suburban rural America, I had like urban superiority. I'm coming from Tokyo. I'm coming from a megalopolis. Who the hell are you with gun racks in your car? And so it was interesting that I was able to insulate myself
Mm.
from messages that possibly could have taken me down and given me like bad perspectives around sexuality. I came to this idea that high school boys were dumb. And again, with that sense of like urban superiority, a sense of that outsider already, being raised by a hard ass feminist grandmother. And I still hold that teenage boys are dumb. That was probably a wise conclusion I came to.
Of course.
And for those of you who were once teenage boys, I don't think you can argue with me on this. So, also during my teenage years, I was self-sexual, but I wasn't sexual with other people. Again, teenage boys are dumb,
Mhm.
right? So I observed the mating habits of American teenagers.
Amazing.
I am Jane Goodall, and I want you to welcome you to the tribes of high school and their mating ritual. Keep your hands within the car. So I watched, I listened. I had a very sexually active um, punk classmate whose adventures I listened to. And I listened and watched and stared a lot. I was a weird kid. Yeah. The privilege of being an outsider. And there's a power to being the outsider and the quiet, nerdy one.
Mm.
But once I got into claiming my adult sexuality, bam, right? But I'm setting all this up because of my framework allows me later on as a sexuality educator to have a different perspective. The disadvantage is I've had to learn what the concerns are of my students and my client base. The advantage is that I give a reframe and that the perspective to my students and clients that not everything about sexuality is natural. In fact, most of it is cultural.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, in my early sex ed as a child, I understood, I got my sex ed from Mutual of Omaha, Wild Kingdom, and having evolutionary biology and extinction theory explained to me.
Mhm.
So now I'm looking at species and at a much bigger time frame, as opposed to me touching here is bad. It's like, oh, my DNA wants to make replications, huh?
Mhm.
Right? And started looking at humans more like locusts
Right.
as resource killers. Strange kid, right? Um, I had I had no idea that I was actually good at public speaking. Like seriously, no idea.
Right.
No idea. I had no opportunity for public speaking. But you know who taught me my first public speaking lesson? was my friend who cast me in a high school play.
Right.
Yay, one. Two, Uncle Sam,
Mm.
US Army. I enlisted in the US Army. Eventually, from enlistment, I ended up getting my commission while attending UC Berkeley.
Oh.
And as a young officer, I was trained how to give a briefing, to organize your thoughts, the presentation, the orders of it, to use something basic like a flip chart or even rocks on a piece of ground, and to be able to deliver information to people with different abilities to absorb information,
Mm-hmm.
and to have command voice, and to believe in my own leadership.
Right.
So thank you, Uncle Sam.
Very powerful.
Very powerful.
Right.
Eventually, I ended up in San Francisco in the latter days of the worst of the HIV pandemic.
Mm.
So I end up in San Francisco as the cloud of death hangs over the city.
Mm.
But I'm a horny young 20 something right out of college. I
Mm.
got lucky. I ended up uh, meeting interesting people. And I had no idea that I would be a sexuality educator. I had no idea. I had like a general degree in psych because that was the thing my prereqs fit into a major.
Right.
I had no plan. I accidentally ended up meeting people with names like Carol Queen, Annie Spinkle, Joni Blank,
Wow.
later Patrick Califia. Um, you know, they were nice people. I had no idea that they were culture makers.
Right.
No idea. I was relatively harmless, seemingly relatively intelligent, kind of interesting, and they took me under their wing. Um, Still friends with all of them except for Joni, who's dead, you know, friend in afterlife,
Mm-hmm.
and Betty. But, you know,
Yeah.
so I got lucky. And then I got uh, suckered into San Francisco Sex Information, which back then had an amazing, top-notch training course as a way to encourage to do peer-to-peer safer sex education. So there's my superhero origin story. It's all accidental. It's fundamentally because I'm unemployable otherwise.
Oh, it's amazing though. I feel like some of the accidents that happen in the world end up being the most celebrated. And so there's a perfect example of that. Lori?
So with all of your experience, what is some bad advice you've heard people in your field give out?
Okay, so this was a career advice given to me as I was thinking about going to make sex education, sexuality education, a paying career.
Mhm.
And because this is a very new career, especially I am not an institutional educator. I'm freelance. Let's face it, I'm an edutainer,
Mhm.
right? Whole different field. I mean, hell, even Dr. Ruth, predecessor, okay, amazing. If you don't know Dr. Ruth, please look up Dr. Ruth, okay? Because we owe so much to Dr. Ruth, so much, okay? Now, so I have no letters after my name. I don't work for an institution. I am not a public health educator. I am not a high school sex ed teacher. And for those of you who are high school sex ed teachers, thank you. I can't imagine doing what you do because high school boys are stupid. Right? Yeah. But really, I can't imagine what you do, right? And I couldn't do it. I could not deal with the school board and the hierarchy.
Mhm.
Um, but as I turned to becoming full-time and full-time educator, edutainer educator, right? Freelance. I got bad advice of, oh, no, no, don't, this is the 90s.
Mhm.
This is the mid late 90s. Don't talk about BDSM. No, 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 that's going to be a career killer. That will like, no, no. And back then, it was incredibly taboo. It
Mhm.
was still part of the DSM,
Right.
still considered as consensual BDSM,
Mhm.
was and still is in many quarters considered a mental health issue.
Right.
And back then, totally was. And that I openly talked about what I call the wacky pokey bindy things. This was, this was, no, don't do it. It will kill your career and no one will pay for it. And it'll be,
Mhm.
uh, there goes your career. And that was a bad advice that I didn't take. I just merrily went along my way, clueless. And there were people wringing their hands, going, "Oh, no, this is a bad idea." I'm like, "Oh, you want to know how to tie each other up? Great." That was bad advice.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's still in the DSM to this day. So I
Yeah. Oh,
absolutely.
it is, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. I think back then it was when uh, same same
Mhm.
sex
Yep.
desire was considered. Now, I want to thank Dr. Charlie Mosier for all the work that he's doing and still doing around bringing humanity back into DSM.
Absolutely agreed. Yeah, with that being said too, speaking on this from a professional standpoint with helping in healthcare professionals, as you know, and as some of our viewers might know, at the Sexual Health Lines, really our goal and mission is to provide high quality sexuality training to those who receive this little to zero sexuality training or education in these kinds of areas. So, in your opinion, based on the work that you do, what is the most important piece about sex in general that you would want providers to know and incorporate into their practice?
I won't say most because most important. There's a whole lot of important things. And I only know my little tiny corner of sexuality education. But something I would like to add to uh, people's toolkit is to consider consider the cultural origins, the cultural framework that each individual client may be coming with.
Mhm.
And they may not necessarily present as being culturally stereotypical of whatever it is that they're supposedly from, which is not only about checking our own practitioner bias, but asking some questions around attitudes around sexuality from families and cultures of one's origin. And today, more and more of us come from multiple intersectional cultures
Mhm.
of influence. Now, taking me, for example, meeting me, you would consider that my internalized sexual attitudes are likely to be typical North American, whatever white people learn about sex in this country.
Right.
And yet it's not. Um, I have, I code switch,
Mhm.
and I code switch often and in different ways. And even within different intersectional cultural background, like, okay, so Asian queers in America, we have our own different baggage and stereotypes, right? And different messages. So keep in mind, I guess it comes down to this, not much natural about human sexuality. So let's figure out what the cultural impact is. And it may come in the simplest thing, like, what is sex?
Mhm. Mhm. I love that. I love that. That's great.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because there's so many people who are interested and each one has their own like experience and background. With that in mind, for someone who's just starting out, maybe gaining interest or realize that they might be passionate about this, what would be your advice for somebody who is interested in BDSM?
Okay, so this is for the people who want to engage.
Yeah.
Okay, so end user, if you will.
Mhm.
All right, so there's the long stuff, which I won't go into, which is like, my lifetime of work, right? I could say, read the book, come to my classes, but here's one. Here's my definition of BDSM. Auntie Midori's definition is BDSM is childhood joyous play with adult sexual privilege and cool toys.
Love
I
that.
love
Yes.
that.
And when you start with that and then break it down, so what is childhood joyous play? And oftentimes in adulting, we forsake play and joy,
Mhm.
right? And yet, as mammals and primates, play is essential. Oh, here. Okay. Ever see sea otters?
I love sea
Right?
otters.
Love sea otters, right? Can you imagine sea otters in an enclosure with no toys?
Oh, they'd be so
Yeah.
sad.
Sad otters. Play is an absolute necessity for mammals, and as primates, it's absolutely essential to keep. I mean, there are more and more findings around neurological health in geriatric psychology around play.
Mhm.
So, as I like to say, don't be a sad otter. Otters have to have toys. Don't be a sad otter.
Oh, I love that. Now
Yeah.
we all need otter toys to remind us.
Don't be a sad otter. Yeah, I got that from Monterey, and then actually one of my students gave that to me because don't be a sad otter.
Yeah.
But play, the spirit of play is absolutely essential to remain a vigorous, alive, living creature, right?
Mhm.
So then think of adult sexual privilege. Now, adult sexual privilege will have massive amount of cultural, gender, and class variance that we assume for privacy, that we assume for consent, that we assume for boundary, that we assume for sexual agency is a privilege that some have and others don't.
Mhm.
How do we move that from not having that privilege to having that privilege?
Right.
So adult sexual privilege, that's one to really like unpack, right? And cool toys. Again, yeah,
Otter.
but cool toys meaning it's using props.
Mhm.
So for example, in Japan, BDSM is essentially just sex with props.
Mm,
Yeah.
absolutely. Wow, yeah, that really is such an important conversation, and I think there's so many aspects of that piece around fun that can be applied to so many areas of our lives as human beings.
I'm personally interested in the whole field of leisure and leisure psychology because I think there's far more overlap
Yeah.
with those researching leisure and BDSM than there is with this idea of mental health disorder. Right?
Mhm.
This is
Mhm.
leisure activity. I mean, some people go, strap themselves into a harness and a rope and hang off of a side of a cliff, and other people strap themselves into a harness and a rope and hang from the ceiling over the bed. I mean,
So true.
both have harness and ropes, and they're both for fun, and you both need privacy and money to do
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
Yeah. So important
And
to unpack.
right? And then permission and access to knowledge and information, resources, equipment, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So next time you're looking at a harness and a rope, whether you're up El Capitan or up on your bed, think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the last questions that I want to ask you, it seems obvious that you wear so many hats in the work that you do. So I'm curious to know if there's any common theme that presents itself among all of these things that you do in your work.
Oh, I do a lot of things. I do indeed a lot of things. I've got my teaching career, I've got my producing classes and events, and then there's my entire art career. And some people, know me from my Japanese bondage book, Seductive Art of Japanese Bondage, so they might think I'm all about the ropes. No, not all about it. You know what's in common with all the different stuff I do? It's all about authentic personal expression through creativity. Okay. So on my teaching side, it's about giving people the tools and the confidence, the options and the exploration to engage in authentic personal self expression through creativity. my art career, as I do multidisciplinary, multimedia social practice. It's about expressing my own creativity and ruthlessly challenging myself to be authentic and expressive. So, two sides, same coin. And without the balance of either, I would be not good at either.
Yeah. Two most important things in my personal life as well: authenticity, creativity. Put the two together, you've magic. Well, thank you so much, Midori. I want to give you this chance to lay out the red carpet and let the world know what you're working on, where they can find you, and anything else you might want them to know.
Thank you. On social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, technically on TikTok. I never use it really. And also Clubhouse at Planet Midori. So for my website, if you just go to planetmidori.com, you'll get to my art as well as my teaching. And now you know why there's a landing page that goes in two different directions. And most important one right now to me is my Patreon. I have been patreon.com/Planet Midori. Yes, there's a definite theme there. Yeah, my wife likes to remind me that I might not be from this world. Anthropology of Earthlings. But in my Patreon, I am having so much fun sharing essays, my artwork, doing live office hours, recordings of classes. I have jammed it in with all the different things of me, and the resources go back, the archive goes back 4 years. You can dig around, and my live office hours are fun. I have really stuffed a lot in there without any lube. It's amazing.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all of those. I know I'm interested to check it out, and definitely check out our workshop this coming month. So that's going to be April 23rd and 24th. You can register and get your tickets on our website, www.sexualhealthalliance.com, and spend the whole weekend with the SHA team and the otter and, of course, Midori. Thank you so
Learn how to
much.
be the happy otter.
Be the happy otter. Yes, absolutely.